The Ring of Fire is a highly anticipated mining development in Ontario's far north. Last month, the federal government's plan for a regional assessment was met with strong words from Indigenous communities there. With us for an update in Sudbury, Nick Dunn, who covers the Northeast for Ontario Hubs. Hey, Nick.
Hi, Jan.
All right, so let's take a step back. For viewers and listeners who might not be familiar with the Ring of Fire, where exactly is it?
So, Jan, the Ring of Fire is a significant mineral region about 500 kilometers northeast of Thunder Bay and a little over 300 kilometers north of Geraldton and Nakina. It surrounds a number of communities in the Mattawa Tribal Council, and further to the northeast along the James Bay coast, there are also the Mushkegowuk Cree communities who are all downriver of this large mineral region.
Now, there's a lot of excitement and concern around the Ring of Fire since its discovery in 2007. What is the significance of this area in Ontario?
So there are a few things here. I mean, it is a significant deposit. Noront Resources has called it the next great mining district, and they've projected potential for 100 years of mining in this region. So, I mean, mining is just generally a large part of Ontario and Canada's economy. But more recently, I mean, over the years, we're seeing a green transition that involves transitioning away from fuel and towards battery powered vehicles and devices. So there's been a lot of economic discussion around a quote unquote, made in Ontario value chain, right? From mining the minerals to shipping them down to southern Ontario to manufacture into batteries and other parts. But it's also, on the James Bay lowlands, a significant peatland, one of the largest carbon sinks in the world that stores, significant amounts of greenhouse gases within it. Lastly, the surrounding First Nations communities are all remote by global standards. They are hundreds of kilometers away from any kind of permanent road system, and some of them face the most significant infrastructure and health issues in the province, let alone the country. Niskandiga First Nation, for example, is under a 27-year boil water advisory. Yamatung First Nation is been under a boil water advisory since the early 2000s. And even Attawapiskat First Nation uses a reverse osmosis station. They're carrying jugs of water to a central station, for their cleaning, for dishes, for drinking, right? And yeah, these communities have a lot to gain potentially, and there's also a lot of environmental, social impacts to potentially mining this huge region.
I want to pick up on your first point about the economic impact. Of course, you're in Sudbury, home of the Big Nickel, and of course, many, know it as a mining town. How does the Ring of Fire compare to not only those mines, but the other mines in the region?
Right, right. So just a caveat on that, the Ring of Fire is still being explored. It's still very hard and expensive to explore this
Mhm.
entire region. So we don't have a complete sense of what the entirety of this region and the surrounding far north has in terms of a mineral potential. But Noront Resources, the company that owns the major, stakes and claims in the region, they've compared this to the Sudbury Basin. And, to give you a bit of a history lesson on Northern Ontario, Sudbury was just supposed to be a rail stop, right, on a Trans Canada rail system. They just happened to find one of the world's largest nickel deposits in the world. And for well over 100 years now, we've been mining this region. There are, 200,000 people who live in the Sudbury district. Mining plays a huge role in that. So to kind of give a historical perspective, if we're talking about the next great mining district, we're seeing generations of mineral activity, generations of environmental and social impacts, again, both potentially positive, potentially adverse.
Now, as I mentioned off the top, the project is finally going through a regional assessment. Now, the language has been interesting. We've heard regional assessment, we've also heard environmental assessment. I'm hoping you can clear that up and let us know what's involved in a regional assessment.
Right, right. A lot of assessments with the Ring of Fire, that's for sure. So typically, environmental assessments are conducted at a project level. So, for example, there are two environmental assessments underway, one to the road to Martin Falls from Nakina, and then a secondary supply road to Webequie First Nation, which is just west of the Ring of Fire. And that road would also connect to the Ring of Fire area. So you're looking at, 300 kilometers of road there that is under a provincial project level assessment. The regional assessment, on the other hand, is a federal process that looks at the broader development of a larger region. So, for example, there was one recently conducted off the shore of Newfoundland to look at offshore oil drilling. So this is comparable in that it's not looking at the impact of any one mine or the transmission lines or the roads or anything like that, but it's looking at holistically what will large-scale mining in this region do environmentally, socially, economically.
And obviously, as you mentioned, there are a number of First Nations communities in and around that area, and they have said that they want a say in the assessment, but they also want it to be Indigenous led. What would that entail?
Right. So, to summarize the current structure that's being proposed, the committee that guides this assessment, the Regional Assessment Committee, that makes the ultimate decisions on how this assessment, this broad scale assessment, is conducted. The members of that committee are appointed by the Federal Minister of Climate Change and Environment and the Provincial Minister of Northern Development and Mines. The First Nations under that structure would have a consulting role. So they would be able to propose the impacts from their perspective, bring Indigenous knowledge to the table, have various sharing circles, and be consulted throughout this project. But a group of about 7 First Nations are proposing that they be partners with the provincial and federal governments so that they, along with those 2 ministers, as a collective, can choose members on the committee. And they're effectively looking for a direct say in the decision making of this assessment rather than a consulting role. That is what they consider to be an Indigenous-led assessment, and that is what they have more or less proposed, having kind of a tripartite agreement, more or less, in choosing the committee that guides this large-scale assessment that will eventually shape the future development of the region.
We have about 30 seconds left. I want to ask, you had mentioned there's a lot of money involved here. There's a lot of assessments involved and a lot of stakeholders here. When would Ontarians actually see shovels in the ground on this?
Well, that's the big question, right? I think we're still at such an early stage as far as getting shovels in the ground that it's hard to say. But, consider the length of time it takes to build an LRT in the city of Ottawa or a subway extension in Toronto. I mean, we're talking about 300 kilometers of road. We're talking about thousands of square kilometers of mineral development. And this is happening in the backyard of a number of communities. And, whether they are pro-resource development like Martin Falls or whether they have concerns, I think everyone wants to know what's going on in their backyard. And that is all part of this process to get this development going. Some people wish it could be easy as just building the road and getting shovels in, but there are a lot of stakeholders involved, and this has wide-ranging impacts for, again, potentially generations. So there are a lot of considerations that have to be made.
Nick Dunn, appreciate it. Thank you so much. Really great stuff.
Thanks, Jan.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.